היי רבית.
אהלן אורלי, מה נשמע?
בסדר, מה שלומך?
מצוין, תודה, תודה על האירוח.
תודה שהצטרף. אני שומעת עוד אנשים נכנסים. אני עוד כאן. שלום אסתר, שלום רות.
מה נשמע?
שלום ענת.
שלום. כן, תודה רבה.
והנה ידידה גם הצליחה בסוף.
יש לי בעיות עם המצלמה, אבל אני יכולה לשמוע.
בסדר.
כן, גם לי.
גם לי יש.
שלום גברת לינדר.
בוקר טוב המורה, מה שלומך?
אוי, איזה כיף לך בשמש.
כן, לא בצל, אבל בחוץ.
בחוץ, כן.
ממש
שלום סטייפן, נכון?
סליחה?
כן, רגע, אני אשנה את השם.
לא, זה בסדר. אנחנו מכירות אותך כ-My Hebrew Playground. היי סיגל.
בוקר טוב.
מה נשמע?
ברוך השם.
היי אורלי.
שלום גיא, שלום איריס. שלום חני. וואי, אני לא רואה את כולם. אסתי. אני צריכה לעבור בין המסכים.
סיגל, שלום סיגל.
היי ענת.
בוקר טוב ג'יל.
בוקר אור.
בוקר טוב.
אוקיי, אנחנו נחכה עוד דקה ונתחיל, בסדר? 11 עכשיו, ניתן צ'אנס לאנשים להיכנס. בינתיים אני מבקשת, אם אפשר לסמן לנו על המפה מהיכן אתם בעולם.
She's starting, I don't know, I'm assuming it's in English because the woman is in English.
היא יודעת אנגלית, she knows Hebrew, but she will speak in English. הנה ענת, אוקיי.
שלום.
היי קטי.
אהלן, מה נשמע?
בסדר, איזה כיף להתראות לפחות בזום.
לגמרי.
לא, זה לא מספיק.
לא מספיק אני מסכימה, אבל לפחות נתחיל ממשהו שזה גם שווה.
כן.
כל הכבוד, יישר כוח, אורלי, אני ממש שמחה להיות כאן.
תודה, תודה, תודה. אני שמחה שאתם כאן, שאתן ואתם. אוקיי, טוב. אז אני עושה סטופ שייר. מי שהספיקה או הספיק לכתוב מאיפה אתם, אני ראיתי האמת מהמשוב, טופס ההרשמה מאיפה רוב האנשים, אז תודה שמילאתם את הטופס. אני אעשה סטופ שייר כדי שאני אוכל לראות את כולם. אז יופי. אוקיי, היי, ליאת כאן, איזה כיף. טוב, אז ברוכות הבאות וברוכים הבאים למפגש נוסף של שפה על הספה, חדר המורות והמורים המקוון והבינלאומי לשפות עולם, בדגש על השפה העברית. אני שמחה מאוד לראות פנים מוכרות ופנים חדשות, ואני מקווה שכולן וכולם מרגישות ומרגישים טוב. במפגש היום משתתפות ומשתתפים בעיקר מורות ומורים לעברית מרחבי העולם, אבל גם מורות ומורים לשפות אחרות מהארץ, מישראל. זוהי זכות גדולה וכבוד גדול עבורי לארח היום על הספה את רבקה בלאוולף, אמרתי את זה נכון?
אנחנו אומרים בלאוולף, אבל זה בסדר גמור.
אוקיי, בלאוולף, שהסכימה לחלוק איתנו מהידע הרב שלה ולהקדיש מזמנה עבורנו בהתנדבות, יש לומר. זה לא מובן מאליו, אז באמת תודה רבה. רבקה היא אימא, היא רעיה, היא מורה לצרפתית בחטיבת ביניים בבוסטון. היא מורת השנה של אקטפל ושל מפלה, מסצ'וסט, ארגון של מורים לשפות, לשנת 2019, והיא מורת השנה של אקטפל לשנת 2020. אני כתבתי שהיא יודעת קצת עברית, אבל היא יודעת הרבה יותר ממה שחשבתי, והיא לומדת, היא עדיין לומדת עברית בישראל, היא מורה מהארץ. יישר כוח רבקה, אני ממש ממש מודה לך שהסכמת לבוא ולהתארח על הספה. אני מבקשת בשלב הזה להשתיק מיקרופונים. ברבע שעה או 10 דקות האחרונות למפגש אנחנו נקדיש לשאלות ותשובות. אז במידה שתהיינה שאלות, אני מבקשת תכתבו אותן בשיחוח, בצ'אט, שיחוח, ובלי עוד הקדמות, רבקה, הספה שלך.
תודה אורלי, שלום לכולם מבוסטון. אני מאוד מאוד שמחה להיות כאן, כי אני כל כך אוהבת את השפה העברית, ועשיתי תואר ראשון בלימודי יהדות, ובאוניברסיטה הייתה לי מורה נפלאה, שנענה לי חשק להיות מורה לשפות, אבל אני לא מלמדת עברית, אני מורה לצרפתית, אבל השנה בתקופת הקורונה הייתה לי הזדמנות ללמוד עוד פעם עברית, וזה כל כך כיף לי, וזה בגלל השפה העברית שפגשתי את בעלי, כי הערכתי חוג לספרות בבוסטון, ויום אחד הוא בא לסלון אצלי לדבר על ספר ישראלי, ומאז אנחנו ביחד. אז תודה לכם להיות מורים לעברית, זה כל כך חשוב לי, ואני מאוד שמחה לדבר איתכם היום. I am going to continue in English just so I can give you the best information. I really, even in French, have a hard time talking about pedagogy. But what Orly had asked me to speak about was just this whole idea of proficiency. And I guess as I speak, I'm guessing that you will be able to make a lot of natural connections to how Hebrew is taught. And I know that that whole Ulpan tradition and Ivrit be'Ivrit connect very closely to proficiency. Not that they're the same thing, but I think you'll notice a lot of overlap. And I am not an expert by any means in Hebrew instruction. I have only been a recipient, but I would certainly be interested in questions that you have sort of about the dynamic between those two sort of structures. And since I've been learning Hebrew again now as a teacher, it's definitely in the back of my mind to think about, you know, when I have a textbook that's given to me, sort of in what ways does it or does it not reflect the sort of proficiency way of thinking about teaching. I guess I will say before I go any further, proficiency is not a way to teach or a method. It's really a philosophy about how and why we learn languages. And there is a lot of different ways to be teaching for proficiency. So I thought what we would get into today is really the what, why, and how of proficiency. And maybe just to tell you about my story. So I started teaching French after teaching English for a year in France. I came back to the United States and I was given a textbook and I was told, you know, ideally, if you could teach all these lessons before the end of the year, that would be great. And I took that very seriously. And there were 180 days of school and I had 14 lessons and I did the math and I spent this many days on each lesson. And whether or not the students really had digested the lesson, we just moved on. And at the end of the year, we could close the book and I could say, I have taught every verb, every vocab. And the high school teachers were so happy because they knew exactly what had been covered in the course. And I taught like that for more than a decade at the middle school where I still work today. And then I went to a workshop about developing thematic units that was led by Laura Terrell, who's an ACTFL trainer who wrote a really excellent book called The Keys to Planning for Learning. It's an ACTFL publication. And she asked some really tough questions that I did not have good answers to. So she asked, you know, do you ever have times where you're giving the test and the students are saying, quick, give it to me before I forget everything? And I thought, oh, yes, that does happen in my classroom. That must suggest that they are cramming information into their short-term memories, which will not stick. And then she asked, at the end of the year, if you were to give maybe your Unit 1 exam from the fall, how do you think students would perform? And I thought, oh, they probably wouldn't do that well because they forget some things. And then she also asked about, to what degree are the students merely being compliant in your course and sort of checking off the boxes of what you're asking them to do? And how often do they have the opportunity to really do any deep thinking? And I have to say, my initial reaction to that was, as someone who teaches beginners, how could they really do any deep thinking? They only have like 100 words. And she sort of opened up my eyes to what a more proficiency-based thematic course can look like. And so inspired by that, I put my children in summer camp for the entire next summer, and I rewrote my entire grade 8 curriculum. And I came in the fall, no textbook, and I tried to just teach these thematic units as best I could. And it was a very tiring, messy year. And the next year I got a little better. And then the year after that, I decided to switch my other course, French 7, to also be thematic units and proficiency based. And now I'd say I'm about 4 years into teaching entirely that way without a textbook. And I've seen some really impressive gains in not only how much French my students can use, but the kinds of students who are successful in my course, and also the degree to which students go on with French after my course. So for me, those have been sort of the main reasons to switch to proficiency. So these are just my contact information. I'm happy to answer questions after this presentation or share other things with you, so don't hesitate to be in touch. And I just wanted to start with that what. Like, what does it mean to teach for proficiency? What do we mean when we use that term? And so I thought we could start by just talking about how proficiency, and these pictures sort of give you a hint at it, is all about real world use of the language and independent use. So if you let your student, if you drop your student in Tel Aviv for 24 hours, if you come back 24 hours later, will they still be in that spot, cold and hungry and tired? Or will they have been able to explain, I have a problem, where am I need food, help me, I need to call my parents, I don't have any money, whatever it is. So can they kind of function in the world? And I think that's very different than how a lot of textbooks conceive about what the goal of language learning is. Often I think textbooks really privilege going through all the grammar points, being extremely accurate in the use of language. And proficiency is sort of a more global approach that's really thinking about what the students can do with the language, regardless of what they know about the language. So for example, you might have a student who you could bring to the falafel shop and they would know exactly what they want and they could order it, but maybe they couldn't ever tell you what a binyan or a shoresh was. Okay, they know Hebrew, but they don't know the names for the things we talk about when we're talking about like Hebrew grammar. And so they're still proficient in the language. They're still able to accomplish their language goals, but they might not be able to talk about it. And I know I had this with my Hebrew tutor last week. She was trying to help me understand the difference between me'az and ba'odshe, something like this. And she had given me examples and I could do all the examples. And then at the end, she said to me, so what's the difference? And I was like, I can't tell you in Hebrew why it's this one for this. Like, I just can feel it. And I think that's an example of that sort of proficiency. Like, you're able to use the language, but you might not be able to talk about all the grammar behind it. And proficiency doesn't consider how you acquired the language. So if you're able to do this because of your family background, or because of travel, or because of years in the classroom, or because you've heard the language growing up, that's all equal. It's just about what you can do now, who can understand you, how many situations you can be comfortable in. And you might be choosing to use that language in your local community, abroad, to connect with real people, whether virtually or face-to-face, or perhaps for your career. So some goals here might be, being able to order in a restaurant. So maybe when you get to the falafel stand, you're able to make it clear that you want one falafel, but you're not able to customize your order, right? So that's like that very beginning learner. And then maybe the intermediate learner is able to say, like, I want it in a lafa and I want extra pickles, but no spice. And the advanced learner would be able to maybe get their order and say, this is not what I asked for, and I need you to redo it. And so sort of thinking about language in that trajectory is one of the ways that we look at proficiency and think about it. being able to go to a cafe, being able to attend a work meeting over breakfast and sort of negotiate that, maybe being able to comment on a favorite YouTube video would all be different ways to show your language proficiency. So all real world tasks where you're working independently. So if we think about what proficiency looks like, we usually talk about communication in 3 modes. And that first one is being able to listen or read messages. And we call that the interpretive mode. So I kind of like doing it with these hand gestures with my students because that helps them understand. So when we talk about the interpretive, it's messages coming at us. And I don't expect the students to be able to translate word for word, but for my beginning students, I might want to show them a video or have them read an infographic and ask them, you know, can you tell me the main idea? Or which of these 3 titles would be the best to describe this infographic? Or can you tell me the who, what, where, when, way, how of this text and sort of give us some context for it. So that might be something in that interpretive mode. The second picture shows what we call the interpersonal mode. So that's spontaneous spoken or written communication. So being able to have a conversation where there's what we call negotiation of meaning. So I ask something and maybe my conversation partner wasn't quite sure what I meant by that. So they might ask for clarification and then I come back to them again and give an example. And then they say, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. And they answer me. So it's not a memorized skit or anything like a play that you're performing with roles. It's really going back and forth with someone else. And it doesn't have to be spoken. You know, if you're texting with someone, that is also interpersonal. It's just interpersonal writing, but spontaneous communication. And then the last part we talk about is presentational. So this is messages that we prepare and that we put out into the world for a particular audience that we are preparing to speak to. And so that might be spoken, a presentational speaking, or a presentational writing, where usually things are polished and you've gotten some feedback from your, you know, teacher or your audience in advance. And what you're putting out there is pretty formal and kind of your best version of your language proficiency. So usually we're talking about these 3 kinds of communication when we're thinking about proficiency with our students. And then I don't know how many, maybe people could use the raise hand function or just physically raise their hand if they have seen this inverted pyramid. I'm just looking around and making my screen a little better. Okay, so some people have seen that before. Okay, great, that's helpful to know. So ACTFL conceives of its levels, and this might be interesting for you to think about in terms of like Kita Aleph and Kita Hey and what matches up. I don't know if there's a formal equivalency. There is a formal equivalency with the European CFR, CEFR levels, if you know, like A1, A2, that kind of thing. So what I like about this is it really speaks to the fact that it's easy to learn a couple words in the language and then things kind of get a lot messier and slower pretty quickly. And so the language proficiency starts down here at this point, the novice, really the person who can only communicate in like memorized phrases, okay? And often the metaphor I use for this with my students is it's like being a parrot, okay? So you can teach it Polly want a cracker and it can repeat Polly want a cracker, but it doesn't know what those words in the phrase means. It just knows, you know, when my owner looks at me like this, it wants me to say, Polly want a cracker. And so our novice students, you know, really just repeat back what they hear from us. They're not able to express personal meaning and they're not particularly creative as a result. They're very, very limited. They may be highly accurate. Okay, you don't necessarily hear a lot of errors from your novices because they only know what you've given them. And if they're good at spitting it back, it'll probably sound pretty good because it'll be what you gave them. Okay, and you can see by how small that novice level is. If you imagine like you've got like a cup of sand and you pour that cup into this prism, you know, that first cup goes in, you might fill that novice level in 1 year of study. But you can see that things broaden as you head into intermediate. And so that 1 cup of sand is not going to bring you out of the intermediate level in a year of study. It's going to be another and another and another. And that intermediate level is starting to be able to create with language. So you're taking all those memorized pieces from when you were a parrot and you're starting to assemble them so that you can survive and get by. So that would be like the person who's dropped in Tel Aviv for 24 hours and has to make their way through. They're thinking, okay, I know how to say want, and eat. So why don't I tell them I want to eat? And then they're, building sentences to communicate their own meaning. And they would be able to ask some simple questions as well. That's a level where things generally get really messy. We see students making lots and lots of mistakes because they're experimenting and because they're stretching. And so something that I learned and I now feel very strongly about in terms of my own students' language development is that I need to always be encouraging that stretch, even when the results are not pretty. Because if I tell them I only want to hear it when it's perfect, then I'm basically saying, go back to being a parrot, right? When it was all just, this and then that and then that. And so if we want our students to grow, we're going to have to accept this period where things are somewhat chaotic and they're trying stuff out that doesn't always work, and have some confidence that it will eventually settle, that they'll hear, the pattern enough times that they'll be able to produce it with greater accuracy. But even intermediate speakers are not easily understood by native speakers who are not used to listening to non-natives speak. And so if my intermediate student is lost on the streets of Paris and they just ask whoever passes by, that person may not even stop walking, right? So they still need what we call the sympathetic listener in order to make their messages understood. If you teach secondary school, this is probably as far as most of your students get. I became trained as an oral proficiency interviewer a few years ago through ACTFL, and I asked the high school teachers, give me your best French student. I want to interview them. And she was the only student who was beyond intermediate in our school. So most secondary students really fall into the novice and intermediate in most sort of American language learning scenarios. Now, I know you guys are all over the world, so this may be a very different story in your context. And then the intermediate, again, I mentioned, is the survivor. So they're able to get themselves out of a situation, but it's not going to be pretty. Okay, it's going to have that messy aspect. And then the next level, and this is really the only one I'll describe because the other two are so rare, we don't tend to encounter them as teachers, is the advanced level. So the metaphor for this one is the storyteller, someone who can tell you about an experience they've had in the past, and they're able to add so much color and texture that you feel like you are there. Okay, so they're going to need all the time frames in order to do that. They're going to need rich vocabulary. They're going to be able to tell you a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And rather than just speaking in phrases or sentences, they're going to be really speaking in like connected discourse. So paragraph level production. Okay, and you can see that that advanced level of the prism is even wider. So maybe you can coach your students up to being advanced in one particular unit that you spend a long time on in your course. But for them to be dropped anywhere in any context and perform as an advanced student will probably take a lot more experience with the language, a lot more familiarity with all the contexts and vocabulary. So that's just a little introduction to sort of how ACTFL conceives of the levels. And there may or may not be a lot of overlap with how you do it in the Hebrew world. I don't know enough to say. So again, we've got the novice, the parrot. So words, very hard to understand in terms of accent sometimes, but also can be very accurate. Intermediate is that survivor. So they're creating with language, they're producing sentences and questions, but it's messy. And then things really start to come together. In the advanced, which is when we get our storyteller and being able to express ourselves across time frames. Okay, so those are kind of the big three when we think about the levels. Now, another way to look at the proficiency levels is to think about the qualifications that you would need for a particular job. So if you think about that novice level speaker having the language proficiency that you would need to stock shelves in a grocery store, for example, that means you're going to need to know the words for the products in the stores. You're communicating in phrases and sentences. Everything that you talk about is probably in a very limited context. It's a pretty small range of vocabulary that you would need to do that job. And it's quite predictable. Bring this box to aisle 10. Bring these boxes to aisle 5. Put them up top, put them at the bottom, that kind of thing. So that's your novice. And then from there, you might think about the intermediate as being more like a cashier. And what's the language you need to check someone out at the grocery store? So you need some words and sentences. You might need to be able to put several sentences together. There's going to be some variety about the kinds of things you talk about, particularly, I don't know where you are, but where I live at Trader Joe's, the cashier always wants to have a conversation with you about like, oh, have you had this before? It's really delicious. You should try it with these crackers, blah, 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 right? So they're able to say quite a bit and putting words together in new ways. So it's not all memorized language, okay? That's your intermediate level, the cashier. And then if we think about the advanced, maybe the customer service representative, that requires a whole nother level of language because you have to be able to connect ideas. There's going to have to be a flow to it. Like, okay, this person's really angry. So I'm going to start by agreeing with them about this one point. And then I'm going to explain the store policy on this and say that, certain things I can't do anything about. And then I'm going to wrap up by saying that I could give them a discount and hopefully that will make them happy or something. So there has to be an order of the comments. The situations are different, right? People come to customer service with all sorts of different problems. So you're not able to just use the same stock phrases again and again. And you have to be a bit more precise. What exactly is the nature of the problem? How exactly are you proposing to solve it? So if that's another way to conceive of proficiency that makes sense to you, it's just kind of a different metaphor for it. Something I talk to a lot about with my students is this whole idea of, when you learn a language, it's just like learning all these other skills. So how did you learn to play the piano? Okay, first you played Row, Row, Row Your Boat 100 times. And then you learned a song that was a little more complicated. And then you started playing a duet. And then maybe you started writing your own music and playing it. Maybe you started to be able to play stuff by ear. And that idea of becoming more independent and more creative, I think for a lot of my students who are in middle school and can be frustrated by like, just tell me what to memorize so I can get an A on the test, this is a helpful way for them to think about it. Swimming is a narrative I use a lot with my parents. I'm not going to give your child a book called How to Swim this year. Instead, we're going to get into the pool, but we're going to get in the shallow end. And we're going to play around there. And then when they're ready, they'll take their kickboard and I will help them across the pool. And that's how we're going to learn language. You're going to do a little bit with a lot of help, and then you're going to do a little bit more with a little less help. So I found that helpful when we talk to students, because I do think if you're switching ways of teaching, that can generate a lot of questions. Or if you're teaching for proficiency in a context where that's not the norm, there can be a lot of questions about why are you doing it this way? Where's the textbook? Why aren't you doing conjugations with the students? That kind of thing. Okay, so that was kind of the big picture of what. And now I just want to talk a little bit about why, and maybe ask you to think for a moment, what are your learners' goals for learning Hebrew? Why are they coming to you to learn Hebrew? And here is a Padlet that my students made about why they were learning French. And, parts of it do line up with ACTFL goals and parts of it are very different. I've got a couple kids who really want to know about food. And so they're taking French class because they're interested in French food. And then I've got other kids who, want to get to that survival level, want to become intermediates or have what they call a natural conversation with someone. So I think very often our students' goals for language learning align well with proficiency because students often really just want to talk to people in the language they're learning. And I think the more we can aim our teaching toward that, the more motivating it is for our students. I have never had a student come to me and say, oh, madame, I've always wanted to learn how to conjugate irregular verbs in French. Or I've dreamt of writing a 2-page essay in French, and that's why I've come to your class. They've never asked if they could please translate something into English from French for me, or could they memorize a dialogue and perform it? And so usually students want that real world experience. And so the more that our course can imitate real life and have them practice making plans, practice solving a problem, doing an actual project together in the language, then they're developing that proficiency every minute they're in the course, but they're already doing it in a way that suggests the real life application of the language. And the classroom itself can be that real life-ish context where the students do the work. So I don't think we need to beat ourselves up that we're not actually dropping them in Paris or in Jerusalem to do the work, but we can create situations that are sort of authentic enough that they get that real life practice. So just to compare sort of 3 different ways, let's say you're teaching clothing. Maybe a not very authentic way to ask students to work on that would be describe to your partner, what are you wearing now, right? And so if Orly asks me to do that, I'm like, what's the question, right? You can see me, you know what I'm wearing right now. That's not a conversation we need to have unless you're blind or we're physically separated or something else. So that's not a super authentic task. We could think about leveling that up a little bit to maybe, could you describe what you're wearing so that someone else could find you that you haven't met before? So sort of trying to layer on an authentic purpose to that same task. And then if we think another way of making it natural and real world, even when we're in the classroom, maybe we could show students an invitation to a wedding and have them work with a partner to decide, what do you think we should wear? So you have that authentic resource, right? That actual document of a wedding invitation from the culture. And then you also have the back and forth that you're negotiating with a classmate about what you should wear. I think we should wear jeans. Well, in Israel, people wear jeans to weddings, but this is not an Israeli wedding. I think we should wear a suit. What? With a tie? Right. So having the students have to talk to each other and negotiate it adds that whole other level. And that lesson isn't necessarily harder to plan, but it demands a lot more of the student and it's more rooted in culture. So a lot of proficiency teaching is trying to think about how can we move from this, which at least for me was very much like the textbook that I was teaching from, to something like this, which does require you to figure out, okay, I need to get like a wedding invitation from the culture. Where do I find this? And then you can find yourself in the Pinterest rabbit hole for days on end, but it can yield a really interesting lesson. I also just wanted to share here, when I switched from doing traditional textbook publisher written assessments to assessing by mode, so interpretive, interpersonal, presentational, my students were much more successful, particularly students who had needed support in the past and had learning challenges. So this is from 2013, 2014 was the last year I gave published written tests. And you can see that my typical students, these are the ones in the dark blue, were acing those tests. And those were the kids who would be like, can you please give me the test right now? Why? Like before it all falls out of my head, because I've just memorized everything and I'm going to like splash it down on the page for you. So some of them got B's, very few got C's, D's, F's on those tests. But my students needing support, so students who had 504s or individual learning plans, students who were seeing the school psychologist for any variety of emotional difficulties, generally speaking, did pretty poorly on unit tests. And you can see that the majority of their grades were in the C range, some doing better, some doing worse. And then when I switched to doing what I would call authentic assessments, so here's an actual YouTube video from France, tell me the main idea, have a spontaneous conversation with someone in the class on this topic that we've been working on, write me a short internet post to tell me, whatever it is that we've been learning in this unit, things changed. So my students, the typical students who before had been acing all the tests, actually had a harder time performing at that level. And you can see they were kind of split between A's and B's once we made that change. And this was frustrating for them. Madame, like, are you saying now I can't just memorize these conjugations? And I don't know exactly what's going to be on the test, and I don't know who my partner is going to be for the conversation. That's more work, right? And it's harder to prepare for because you can't just memorize and spit it back. For my students with learning challenges, all of a sudden the playing field was a little more equal. So I had some very high energy boys who they could watch a YouTube video and they didn't understand half of it, but that did not freak them out. They were frankly used to not understanding a lot of going on in my class. So they would kind of stay with the YouTube, they would look at the pictures, they would take a risk and maybe make a guess on the main idea. And a lot of the times they were right, okay? And the students who maybe weren't super consistent about doing the homework, weren't great spellers, sometimes were very bold conversationalists and would do a great job in those spontaneous conversations because it didn't involve having to know a certain thing. It involved being spontaneous and finding a way to make the conversation keep going. And so their grades really moved from being mostly C's when we were doing the publisher written to quite a few B's and even some A's and then still some C's. So to me, that really spoke volumes about making room for every student in my curriculum and making sure that everyone had a place to shine. And I really hadn't asked students to interpret authentic documents before this, nor had I asked them to do spontaneous conversations. And by counting that equally and making that really important in the course, that sent a message, I think, to students that all of these things have value in becoming proficient in French. So ultimately, this is what we want, right? We want our little kittens to feel like they are the lions who can do anything in the language. And I do think that the feedback that we give students has a lot to do with how confident and how motivated they feel. So I wanted to share with you this vision, this sort of image of the proficiency tree, which comes from Chantal Thompson at Brigham and Young University. And basically what she says is that when you're evaluating a student's language performance, you really want to think about 4 things. And she conceives of it as a tree. So the trunk of your tree, the base without which you would not be a tree, is your language functions. What can you do with the language? Can you describe? Can you express how you're feeling? Can you ask questions? That is the most fundamental thing. Okay, so those are your functions, and everything we do has to be focused on functions and making sure that we're really giving our students opportunities to work with all the basic language functions on a really consistent spiraling basis, so that they're always describing, they're always asking questions, they're always narrating a story as they go through their studies. Now, this function has its roots in what we call content and contexts. So for the content, can they do it about their house? Can they do it about their clothing? Can they do it about their family? Can they do it about their free time? And being able to do all the language functions on different topics means that the student is more rooted in the language, right? Because they can handle more types of situations. And then the context is the social situation. So yes, you can order a falafel at a stand, but can you give a formal talk on the role of falafel in Israeli culture, right? That's a whole different context. That's like an academic language. And again, you're going to need a lot of language in order to handle speaking in different levels. And I know this is true for me even now after studying French for almost 30 years. When I won the ACTFL prize a year ago, I was spontaneously asked to present the French ambassador at this luncheon the next day for French teachers. And the way you present an ambassador in French involves all this fancy language and these like formulas of politeness that I never used. And I was reading off of a Post-it to introduce this guy because it was all this stuff I had never seen. His Excellency, the ambassador, blah, 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 right? So that was a new context even for me. So content and contexts are our roots. We've got the functions in the trunk of the tree, and then we do the branches of the tree. And this is what she calls text type, which basically means our students expressing themselves at the word level, phrase, sentence, strings of sentence, a whole paragraph, right? And so the text type that students are able to produce is probably the #1 indicator of their language proficiency. If you have a student who cannot communicate in sentences, it doesn't matter how amazing or interesting what they're saying is, they are a novice, okay? If you can express yourself in sentences, even if it's kind of a hot mess, you're pretty much an intermediate. And only when you're expressing yourself in paragraphs are you going to be an advanced student, okay? And I have to say, I hadn't paid attention to this very much with my students previously. And then I started giving these speaking assessments where they would have conversations in groups, and I was taking notes on text type, and I realized I had all these students who were not yet expressing themselves at the sentence level, and yet my course goal was that they would be intermediate learners. And so I realized, oh my gosh, I need to make this much, much more of a priority. Okay. So I've talked a lot about different aspects of language. There's one aspect I have not yet touched on, right? The leaves of the tree. Now, would you agree that a tree without leaves is still a tree? Yes, anyone in New England? The leaves are down, but we still have trees, right? Okay, so those leaves, the beautiful decorations on our trees, that's accuracy, okay? That's remembering when it's shin and when it's sin and when it's tough and when it's tet, and when it's aleph and when it's ayin, all those good things that I'm still working on. That's the leaves of the tree. So the point here is you still have a tree without the leaves. And for many, many years, many language teachers, myself included, we spent all of our time polishing the leaves of the tree. We were obsessed with the leaves. And our minds can only hold so much information. So if we have all of our focus on the leaves, it's very hard to pay attention to the trunk and the roots and the branches. So anyways, I found this a very helpful visual to try to think about the context of my students' language performance, what things matter, and trying to hold them in balance. Now, when we're in school, it's not the most real world context for language learning. And so we sort of tend to talk about that as performance. And then when we let our students loose in the world, that's when we really see their language proficiency. So my favorite example of this would be, let's say you're planning a field trip for your students to go to an Israeli restaurant, and they've learned how to order, and they know what the different options will be to eat, and everyone's ready, and you arrive at the restaurant and they sit down and they're ready to place their orders. All of that is performance, right? You have coached your students to be able to do all those things. They know exactly what to expect, and they are going to feel so confident because they know what to do and they're going to get to do it. But a group of Israeli tourists shows up at the restaurant and they think it's adorable that you've brought your whole class here and they want to talk to them. So they start going up to the students. Oh, where are you from? Oh, how long have you been studying Hebrew? Okay, your students weren't expecting that. The tourists don't know which vocabulary your students have already studied. They might ask something where the students have no idea what they're being asked. That's proficiency. That's sort of the real world of language. And we can't make that happen in our classes. We're too nice, right? We're not going to ask students things that they can't answer. We know exactly what is in their bubble of comfort, and we pretty much keep them there because that's how you make progress, right? But I think at the same time as we're doing that, we need to also prepare our students that there's going to be a time they go into the world and they're going to have to handle some unpredictable situations. And so that's sort of where proficiency really lands. We can't teach for proficiency in our classrooms because they are these artificial environments. But if we can teach for performance, each one of those little performances eventually builds up our students' proficiency so that they advance. Okay, so we talked about the what, we talked about the why, and I just want to wrap up by talking about the how, and then I'd be very curious to hear your questions. So if we think about this tree and these levels and how students learn language, what implications does that have for how we spend our time in the classroom and what we expect of our students? And so a document that if you're not familiar with, I thought would be handy to introduce you to today are these world readiness standards for world language learning that you can easily find online from ACTFL. And what they are really is this kind of foundational document that talks about like, what are the things we want to focus on for language learning? And they're divided into 5 areas. And then those areas have little subsets, but they really talk about like, what do students do? What are we actually expecting of students? So you can see here in the United States, we talk about the 5 C's of language learning. And of course, the biggest one is communication, right? That's what every student is coming to your class for. They want to be able to communicate. And we talked about the interpretive and interpersonal and presentational aspects of communication. So that's going to be obviously super, super prominent in our teaching. But there are other pieces like communities. Are there ways for our students to be in community with others through, for example, the Hebrew language? Is there a way to set our students on a path for lifelong learning so that even though, you know, at one point I was a 20-year-old learning Hebrew my 2nd semester of college, you know, how do you build someone who will eventually be 46 years old and thinks it's fun to get up early on Sunday and learn more Hebrew, right? So that idea of lifelong learning. Comparisons, having our students make linguistic comparisons and start to notice patterns. I think certainly with the binyanim, that was a huge part of my language learning in Hebrew, was noticing those patterns. And then also making cultural comparisons and trying to understand our own culture in comparison to that of Israeli culture. Connections can start to think about, you know, connections between our discipline and the sciences and the arts, etc. And then cultures, you know, ACTFL's been working on this kind of interesting way of talking about culture in terms of the 3 Ps. And I don't know how much this is out there in the world of Hebrew, but it's practices, products, and perspectives. And so I thought I would just zoom in on this for a minute as kind of a side note, because for me, it's been a very helpful way to approach culture in my class. And I think the idea would be for students to be able to look at culture without judgment, And so you might pick a product, so something that you would see in a culture. So I picked the sign that I remember from when I would take the bus in Jerusalem, mipnei seva takum, that you're going to stand before your elders and think about, okay, wow, we do not have signs like that on the buses in Boston. What's going on there? So that's the cultural product. That's the artifact. And then we have to think about what's the practice. Oh, the practice is when you get on a bus in Israel, people expect you to give up your seat for someone else. And I still remember being on a bus in Jerusalem in 2001, and the woman behind me threw up on the bus. And as a good New Englander, I just kind of covered my face and was like waiting for this to stop happening. But everyone around me noticed that I had a water bottle in my backpack, and they were like, give it. And everyone, they were like, give her your water bottle. And I was like, really? This is like not just like a plastic disposable water bottle. Oh, people did not care. And so I gave this woman my water bottle, and she was drinking the water bus, and I was like, wow, things here operate in a totally different way. And so just like that idea of cultural responsibility, people taking care of one another, that is a practice, at least that's aspired to, right, by the sign. And then that perspective, right? So the practice is that you help someone. And then the perspective is that, there's a long Jewish tradition of respecting our elders, and we're going to live that even when we're taking public transportation in the 21st century. So that might be just a helpful tool for talking about culture with your students. I actually do teach my students the 3 Ps, and then I'll give them just one of the 3 and ask them to figure out the other 2 by watching a video or reading an article about sort of how that is lived in French-speaking culture. So if we were just to look at one standard, I just wanted to introduce you to how the standards connect to these can-dos. You already saw the interpretive and the interpersonal and the presentational. But then what's kind of neat is ACTFL says, okay, so overall, the interpretive mode is about understanding, interpreting, and analyzing what is heard or read or viewed. And then, we can see some nice real world examples of that, like what are students actually doing? And then what's nice on the website is that they actually have these what they call can-do statements, where you actually think about how would I write a daily lesson objective in this focus area according to my students' proficiency level. So for example, here, students can identify details about the school calendar from different cultures. So they're given a school calendar from Senegal. They're looking at their own school's calendar, and they're trying to make a Venn diagram, what's same, what's different. So it's just can be interesting to use the can-do statements as a way to try to make sure that you're getting at a level that is appropriate for your learners within that particular mode, whether it be interpretive, interpersonal, or presentational. These are examples from interpersonal. And, maybe here it's like students can ask and answer simple questions about a video based on the importance of school. So we can, guess that because it's ask and answer simple questions, it's probably, novices, maybe veering into intermediate. Presentational, they've got some real world suggestions for what to do. And then the example might be students can compare typical school days based on interviews of students from other countries. So usually the presentational is going to happen after students have done some reading or some learning, and then they're ready to present some information. Being able to compare can still be a novice task if you just do it with words like and but, and that's kind of the level of your comparisons. But that kind of gets at the idea of having some deeper thinking, even with very, very simple language. I just wanted to show you how you can grow a standard into a can-do statement. So here's this general standard about interpersonal communication. And then what they do is they kind of map it on to can-do statements. So the interpersonal is about exchanging information and ideas, meeting my needs, and then expressing preferences and opinions. And so there's different parts to that communication. But then we have this really extensive document where you can say, okay, I'm looking for interpersonal tasks, I'm looking for novice, and then for each one of those, exchanging information, meeting needs, expressing preferences, you have examples of targets, of lesson targets. So if you're teaching somewhere where that's important, or if you're looking for a way to try to organize your lessons kind of systematically, I have found this a very, very helpful approach. Particularly when I'm noticing I'm in a situation where I've asked students to do something that they're not able to do. That's usually a sign that I have overreached my can-dos and I've tried to bring them into a level where they're just not there yet. So this might be a resource for you to check out after this talk, just to see the can-do statements by level and by topic. So here's an example, I think this is the last one, to just think about how we can take the language function, so that was like the trunk of the tree, and then marry it to the roots, the context, and then the how well is sort of the language level. So let's say, if we've got express, ask about, react with some details to preferences, feelings, or opinions, that's the function. And then you do it on whatever your familiar topic is. So right now my students are doing a unit on tiny houses. I would expect them to do this about tiny houses, something that you really worked on quite a bit. And then the how well is about the level. So if we're asking them to create simple sentences and ask appropriate follow-up questions, you know, that's probably our novice highs, we would call them, or our intermediate lows, students who are beginning to communicate in sentences and ask questions. So this is kind of a recipe for how we can take a language function, root it in the context of whatever we're studying, and then be realistic about what we expect from students at that level. Okay, so that was a very, very lot of me talking. I will leave my contact information up here for the future. And then Orly, I think you're going to be more facile than I am at reading through the chat, but if there's questions that have come up, I would love to hear them. I'll open the chat as well. Oh, that's in English. Okay, maybe I can handle this.
אוקיי, קודם כל, המון תודה. תודה רבה.
בבקשה.
ההרצאה הנהדרת הזאת. כל פעם שאני שומעת על הפרופישנסי, אני לומדת עוד משהו חדש שלא ידעתי, או שאני רואה את זה בדרך אחרת. המטאפורות שהשתמשת בהן נהדרות. פשוט תודה רבה. יש כאן שאלה, I have a question, which language do you use along the lesson? Do you also combine student L1 in some cases? Perhaps when you feel communication may improve using it.
Okay, so thank you for that question. And I will say that ACTFL has 6 core practices, and I sort of toyed with the idea of organizing my talk around them today, and I did not. But the number one core practice is that 90% plus of the course takes place in the target language. So then the question becomes, okay, if I'm allowed to have 10% in English, in my case, what are the situations when I would really need that? So for me, it's a lot of tasks where we're talking about our learning. If I'm asking students to reflect, like when you saw them setting goals, what do you want to get out of French 6 this year? That I definitely want them to do in English because I know they don't have the language and it's very important to the course. I teach middle school, so if there's some sort of break in the norms or the way that people are treating each other, that will usually be a time for me to stop and speak in English and try to figure out what's going on. And then I tend to write directions in English as well and ask questions about readings and videos in English. And again, my students are novices, so I am wanting to make sure that they're going to show me everything they can do, and they're not going to get lost in reading the directions in French and misunderstand me or use up all of their energy and focus on the directions. And then by the time they get to the task, they're kind of like, whew, I'm pooped out. I'm done. I got nothing for you, right? And then with like a video, you know, if I ask them, tell me what you understood in French, often they'll just pull words from the video and I won't get like that deeper sense of what they understood. Whereas if I ask them to do it in English, first of all, they can't just pull stuff from the article or the video. They have to say it in their own words because there was no English in the video. And then often I'll get a much deeper sense of what they understood or frankly didn't understand because they're doing it in their L1. Now, I would just add, really depends if your students share a common L1. I know in the Ulpan setting, that's not a luxury that you necessarily have. So, you know, I'm in a context where most of my students speak English as a first language.
Thank you. Any other questions? יש עוד שאלות? אני חושבת שהפרזנטציה הייתה נהדרת. אני בטוחה צריך לאבד את מה ששמענו וראינו, צריך to process. אני אשמח אם יש עוד למישהו שאלות, הערות. סייפה?
אפשר? רק רציתי להגיד תודה. זה לא פעם ראשונה שאני בהדרכה או בהרצאה על הפרופישנסי approach, וזה היה, כמו שאורלי אומרת, הבאת זווית חדשה, הבאת אור, like you shed light, על דברים, זה היה מאוד מרתק. אני באמת חייבת להגיד תודה, תודה, תודה.
בבקשה, בשמחה.
תודה רבה.
גם אני רוצה, כן, לומר, תודה רבה רבקה. השימוש במבנים החזותיים ובאנלוגיות, המטאפורות שנתת פשוט המחישו באופן ממש ממש טוב את השלבים השונים ברכישת השפה. אפילו הציון הזה של ב-ACTFL levels, על הרמה של הנוביס, כמה שזה קטן, פשוט ה-visual literacy שלך, פשוט באמת, כמו שסייפן אמרה, הבאת אור, באמת, והארת, עם ה' וא' וגם עם עין. פשוט ממש נהדר. תודה רבה.
היא לא סתם מורת השנה של אקטפל לשנת 2020, הלו. תודה. עוד שאלות, עוד הערות, כולם מוחאים כפיים פה אני רואה, כל הכבוד.
יש לי שאלה, הבנתי שאמרת שאת לא מלמדת מספרים.
מיכל.
כן, אמרת שאת לא מלמדת מספרים.
נכון.
השאלה היא, למה אין ספרים בשיטת הפרופישנסי? למה לא כותבים ספרים לפי השיטה ואפשר ללמד לפי הספר?
Okay, so I think I understood your question, but I am going to answer in English. They are beginning to write textbooks for proficiency, and I don't think it's impossible that there could be such a thing. I know most districts, so in the United States, districts buy textbooks and they loan them to students. So it's in the district's interest to keep the textbook for as long as possible. Most textbooks will live 10, 15 years in a classroom, which means they're necessarily outdated very quickly. I taught from a textbook that had French francs instead of the euro at least 5 years after the currency change. And so I think if you want current information and students who look like the students in your classroom and like a sensitive treatment of maybe the gender spectrum, for example, it's very hard with a textbook if your district is going to buy it and then you're going to have to teach from it for 10 to 15 years. But there are definitely companies that are hearing the ditch the textbook stuff on social media and kind of scrambling to get ahead of that by creating proficiency-based textbooks. And I am lucky. I teach at middle school. I only have 2 preps. For a high school teacher to transition, 4 courses from textbook to self-written thematic units is a huge task. It would take probably a decade. And so I do think there needs to be some material created for teachers so that we're not expected to just do this every morning, every night, every summer, and every weekend. I'm just going to put in the chat 2 things I referenced that are useful follow-ups. The core practices, if you Google ACTFL core practices, you'll see those big 6, and you can read more about them. They're pretty kind of a handbook for how you enact proficiency. And then this ACTFL book by Terrell and Clementi, Laura Terrell being the woman who gave that workshop that changed my life, called Keys for Planning for Learning, which is all about how you plan a course for proficiency using thematic units. And there are sample units in there. I found it very useful. And there's a newer edition, I think, that came out in the last year or 2.
תודה. בבקשה, אסתר.
My question is actually about the reading. I'm using the proficiency method, but if the students don't know to read and it's Hebrew letters, it's not French English letters. Yeah. When I teach, let's say, when I introduce the word sefer, as long as they do not know the letter. Should I write in transliteration ACTFL and then switch to Hebrew once they complete the acquisition of the letters, or start using the Hebrew letters from the beginning, in spite of the fact that they don't know to read it?
I have no idea. I have never taught Hebrew. My own experience was that the teacher did not use English alphabet, and it was very difficult for me because I had no background. I didn't know that Netanya was a city. I would read, and I didn't know I didn't know that, you know, what's a good example? I didn't know that Noga was a name of a girl, right? So everything that was proper nouns was like, for me.
Yeah,
but yeah, Orly, do you want to comment on that? Do you know?
אני לימדתי תלמידים, התחלתי ללמד כאן עברית כשפה שנייה, שלימדתי תלמידים בכיתה א', אז השתמשתי בעברית, אבל כמובן שכשראיתי שיש איזו היסטריה ולא מבינים אותי אפילו שאני עשיתי את כל התנועות בעולם,
כל ההצגות, פנטומימה.
כן נתתי איזה, את יודעת, עוגן. אף פעם לא כתבתי באנגלית עברית. אם כבר, אז לכתוב באנגלית, בשפה שלהם, אבל לא כתבתי בתעתיק בכיתה כשלימדתי עברית. זאת תשובתי. יש למישהי הערה אחרת או תובנה אחרת? מישהו?
אני יכולה... אולי, אני גם מלמדת כיתה א', ואני גם לא כותבת אף פעם באנגלית. מה שאני מוצאת הרבה פעמים, אני משתמשת לנאום, זה יותר קשה, אבל לאבג'קט, כאילו, זה דברים הם לא יודעים לקרוא עדיין, אנחנו שמים תמונות, כמה שאפשר תמונות, ואז הם קוראים את התמונה, ואז הם לומדים את השפה. ומה שנפלא היום, באמת עם כל הטכנולוגיה שיש לנו, אז אני משתמשת הרבה יותר record yourself, כאילו להקליט את עצמכם, אז הם מדברים אליי, הם לא צריכים להקריא לי או לקרוא. אני מדברת אליהם בהקלטה, אפילו אם הם בבית, אז זה עוזר לי.
עדה, הסאונד שלך כל כך לא טוב.
לא שמעתם?
שומעים בערך כל מילה שנייה. אז אני חושבת שהצלחתי להבין שאת מבקשת מהם להקליט לך בעברית, במקום לכתוב, כי הם לא יודעים עוד לכתוב. זה מה שאמרת?
שמעת? מה שאמרת?
אני לא כל כך...
ועכשיו?
רגע, בואי ננסה.
אולי יכולה לכתוב בצ'אט?
כן, זה גם רעיון טוב.
או לקרוא כל כך. כן, עכשיו שומעים יותר טוב לי?
קצת יותר טוב.
קצת יותר טוב, אבל לא מצוין. עכשיו את קפואה. טוב, אני אשמח אם או שתכתבי או שתדבר על זה אחר כך, בסדר? תודה רבה. עוד לפני שאנחנו משחררות את רבקה, יש עוד שאלות, עוד הערות באלף, בעין.
תודה רבה.
המון תודה. תודה לכל המשתתפים והמשתתפות. תודה רבה רבקה, זה היה מאוד חשוב לכולנו, אני חושבת, כדי לקדם את הוראת השפה העברית באשר אנחנו, איפה שאנחנו בעולם. ואם תרצו להיות בקשר עם רבקה, היא אישה מאוד מאוד נחמדה וחביבה, תוכלו להיות איתה בקשר, נכון?
כן. נכון.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה ותודה רבה.
ערב טוב, לילה טוב, בוקר טוב, צהריים טובים, איפה שאתם בעולם. תודה שהשתתפתם, וניפגש על הספה בעוד חודש.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, רבקה.
להתראות.
תודה רבה גם לך, אורלי.
להתראות.
להתראות.